This is what we are. We are alive.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. Andres, I just want to say thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I think we're like 30 minutes in, and this is the coolest conference I've ever been to. I'm not just sucking up. So my day-to-day, I work with governments primarily, which tells you a lot about the people that I'm used to dealing with, and sort of gatherings like this don't have the same level of creativity or serendipity or certainly randomness, to the point where I didn't even think about putting a GIF in my presentation. So thanks a lot, Angeli, for making me feel even worse about that. So I wanted to talk, because we're talking the big picture, I guess, of internet culture, and I want to go really big and talk about foreign policy and how does the internet affect foreign policy. And I want to talk about a couple of different things with the time that I have. So one is around soft power, and I'll explain what soft power is. I mean, some of you might be familiar with it, but I want to give a kind of intermediate level introduction to that. And within talking about soft power, talk about a research collaboration project that I've done, well, my company, Portland, with Facebook. And I'll get into why that will take us on to the intersection of soft power and internet culture, which is digital diplomacy. So we're going to start at a very high level with thinking about international relations and foreign policy. So what is power, right? Let's just start with a definition. So in foreign policy terms, power is the ability of one country to change the behavior of another country to get them to do something they otherwise would never have done. So that's power at its most basic. So if that's power, what is soft power? And more importantly, why does it matter? Why is it worth me talking at you for 15 minutes? Power really exists on a spectrum. And there are two types of power. I think it's most helpful to start with hard power. So hard power is about force. It's forcing somebody to change their behavior. And hard power relies on tactics like military force, economic sanctions, or simply paying somebody to do something, right? So it's about coercion. It's about forcing them. It's push. In contrast to that, soft power is about using attraction and persuasion to get someone to change their behavior, maybe to get them to change their mind, change their preferences. And rather than, you know, the push, it's more of a pull, right? So soft power is about getting others to want what you want and getting them to do something because they find you credible and admirable, and they think, oh, well, you know, if Spain always tends to do the right thing, and if they want us to get involved with this, then we should probably do it. And so soft power is generated and leveraged through strategies like public diplomacy, like cultural promotion, and generally making a good positive impact in the world. So that's kind of hard power and soft power. Joseph Nye is a Harvard academic, and he's the one who originally coined the term soft power back in 1990. And when he set out his definition of soft power, he said there are three main sources of soft power, right? Three pillars of soft power. And they are political values. So these are things like human rights, democracy, free press, free speech. Culture, now this is both high culture, so it can be the Bolshoi Ballet, it can be Gaudi, but it can be pop culture as well, so it can be The Simpsons or Transformers or One Direction. And then the third pillar is foreign policy, and this is the extent to which a country is seen as being overall a force for good or a force for ill. So does a country act with moral authority in the world? So that's hopefully a decent introduction to what soft power is and where it comes from. So the next question is, well, you know, why does it matter? I've argued for a while now, really, that there are two broad global megatrends that make soft power more important to the future conduct of successful foreign policy. The first is the rise of networks, and this comes about primarily through the diffusion of power, right? So we have been living for a while and are continuing to live through a period where we're seeing economic and political power move from west to east, from north to south. But importantly, it's also moving away from governments altogether towards non-state actors. So, NGOs, philanthropies, organizations like Oxfam, Red Cross, Amnesty International, but also companies, entrepreneurs, individuals, are having more of an important impact on shaping global events. I would also add to that the rise of cities as players in foreign policy is something that is also kind of changing the model of state-dominated foreign policy. We see that particularly with, I would say, issues around like climate change. The second global megatrend is kind of self-evident. It's like, why are we here, right? And that's that we inhabit an increasingly digital world. I know it borders on cliche to say it, but it is important, and it's having an impact on how governments are responding. So the digital revolution, which we'll be talking about throughout the weekend, I suppose, and the democratization of access to information, the speed with which it moves, leads to demands for greater transparency, but it also leads to people having more platforms to be visible, to be politically active, to share their views, and it creates just a multitude of communications channels and platforms that individuals can use, but also governments and non-state actors can use. And so if we take these two megatrends together, we essentially end up with a much more complex, multipolar world where countries going out and trying to do something by themselves, to take unilateral action around something, isn't impossible, but it's much more difficult, and the price is much higher for that. So we're now in a world where really collaboration between different countries, but also between non-government actors as well, as how you drive change. The big global challenges that we face right now are not ones that can be addressed by any one country or any one actor. It requires networks essentially to work together. So soft power is basically the glue that allows different actors to form networks to drive collaboration. It's what powers collaboration, really. So that's why I would argue soft power is more important and really, I think, reflects the future of foreign policy. So soft power is quite complex. There's a lot of things that go into it, and I'll sort of come to how we've dealt with that. Now, the Soft Power 30, which, like I said, was a research collaboration between Portland and Facebook, and this actually goes back to research that I've been doing on soft power for years now, going back to 2010. But we tried to bring some structure to the complexity of soft power and try and work out how can we quantify this, how can we structure it. And the Soft Power 30 was the most recent answer to that challenge. And essentially what it is a composite index of just over 65 metrics, and it blends both objective statistical data with some subjective polling data, because we're talking about soft power, which is about attraction, which is, inherently subjective. So we had to design some subjectivity into how we measure soft power. It's a tool for understanding the relative strengths and weaknesses of a country's soft power assets. So, what are the things that make them attractive, or maybe the things that detract from the way people perceive a country. And importantly, the big disclaimer is this is not a measure of overall influence. It's about potential for influence. It's what are the resources that you have that are likely to make you attractive. I'm not going to dwell on this too long, and actually the workshop that I'm doing on Sunday will spend a bit more time unpicking this. But the thing that I want to highlight is this is the objective part of the data for the framework of the Soft Power 30. And we start with Joseph Nye's 3 pillars that I mentioned, right? So the political values, culture, and then foreign policy becomes engagement in this. And it's just how engaged is a country in the global community. And there are metrics within all of those categories, but then we did a full academic literature review and sort of worked out, okay, what are the other things that factor into this? And we worked out that enterprise and education were important, but increasingly, and what I really want to highlight is with the laser pointer, that digital is really critical. And this is where the partnership with Facebook came into play, where they helped us develop some metrics that basically we have 2 components to the digital category of our metrics. And the first is just looking at how connected is a population. What's their access to the internet? How are they using it? Are there any government services provided online? Just how much value is a population deriving from the internet? How well connected are they? And then the second set of metrics, we worked with Facebook's data science team to develop some metrics around digital diplomacy. So how well is a government engaging with international audiences, international publics through social media channels? And then, like I said, we have to design in some subjectivity, so we did some international polling as well, and along 7 different categories, which were like the important touch points that people are likely to experience a country in some way. this was the countries that we polled, 7,200 people across 20 countries. And then this is just a summary of how all of the metrics come together, which again, I won't dwell on, but what I just want to point out is the importance of the digital component. These are the results, not going to dwell on them. I've just highlighted, since we're in Barcelona, Spain came 14th, which is a pretty good showing. But if anybody has questions about this, I'm happy to talk during lunch or whatever, so just come find me. Okay, so that's soft power and how we've tried to measure it and how we felt that digital is an important part of it, and I think an increasingly important part of it. The intersection of soft power and internet culture, I think, means we arrive at digital diplomacy. So I want to put this in context of kind of real life. So if we step back in time 15 years ago to 2001, I probably should have chosen Spain. I don't know why I did Italy, but here's a map of Italy. And that right there, I guess, that's meant to be Rome. So 2001, a new US ambassador is appointed to Italy, right? So he shows up. I think his name was Melvin Sempler or something like that. So Ambassador Sempler shows up. There are probably 200 people, 200 to 300 people in all of Italy that he needs to engage with, that he really needs to deal with, right? It was just the elites. That was pretty much it. So it was, business leaders, senior politicians, some journalists, and maybe a handful of other people, and maybe the Pope. So that's pretty much it, right? So fast forward to today, social media and digital diplomacy, rather than it being a game of elites, now everybody matters. So now rather than have to deal with 200 people, a new incoming ambassador has to deal with whatever, 20 to 30 million Italian adults who have social media and have a channel to get through to him, can tweet at him, can post on his Facebook page. And so rather than just having nice cocktail parties and lunches or whatever, now ambassadors have to be accessible to millions of people. They have to engage with them. They have to communicate with them. Importantly, they have to listen to them as well. It's not just about broadcasting. So how are governments responding? Well, they're responding through digital diplomacy. And I say the more savvy ones are responding through digital diplomacy because, there's a broad spectrum of performance when it comes to digital diplomacy, looking at different governments. And so this is just a simple kind of framework of the different types of, or different ways that digital diplomacy is done. So we start with co-creating communications, and I'm going to just run through an example of each of these quickly. Advocating for values, informing publics, trolling for effect, which I quite like, campaigning, and then eventually collaborative policymaking. So if we start with co-created communications, the Iran deal last year, which was a really big deal. If you're not familiar with it, Iran was basically brought back into the international community in exchange for dropping their pursuit of a nuclear arms program, right? So it involved a lot of countries to try and get this deal done. It also involved a huge communications effort, right? And not only to try and influence the Iranian public and pressure Iranian leaders into negotiating and eventually agreeing a deal, but also publics in countries like the US or the UK or Europe. There were people who were skeptical about this. So it took a huge effort that used traditional media, but also pretty much every single social media channel going. And importantly, I think this is a great example. This is one of the first examples of Medium being used in a sort of campaign like this. And what was cool about the use of Medium in the Iran deal is that it involved multiple governments working on the platform. So it wasn't just the White House or the State Department putting out their message, but up here you've got Philip Hammond, who's the UK Foreign Secretary, is posting on this platform as well. So advocating values, these are some tweets from the British Embassy in the US on International Day Against Homophobia. So, they've got one of the best relationships in the world, the US and the UK, and here's an instance where this is before the US had sorted out same-sex marriage with the Supreme Court, but you have the UK basically ribbing its best friend saying, you're being a dick about the same-sex marriage thing through Twitter, which I think is brilliant. Informing others. So it's easy to inform people, and this is what embassies have always done, right? But now with digital diplomacy, with social media, they can do this with much more engaging content. So I think this was last year, the mayor of Washington, D.C., when they changed the laws around decriminalizing marijuana, the D.C. mayor said, don't worry, we're not going to turn into Amsterdam overnight. It's going to be fine. Well, the Dutch embassy in Washington, D.C. did not like that very much. And so then they created this graphic thinking Well, actually, let's just compare DC and Amsterdam really quickly, and sort of had a go at how crap public transport is in Washington, DC, and other elements that are better about Amsterdam. But also, if you look down here, how much marijuana you can legally have in Amsterdam versus how much you can have in Washington, DC. It's actually way more in DC. So, if anything, DC is worse when it comes to drugs. Anyway, campaigning. This is pretty simple. And digital diplomacy just gives you a new way to do this. It's just new outlets for it, right? So this is campaigning for long-term global change. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the He for She campaign that was started by the UN, and they've got Twitter page, Facebook page, and they marry that well with sort of online and offline events, and it's just a way to amplify that message. But then you can do campaigning on through digital diplomacy on really short-term objectives as well. So New Zealand, for example, campaigned really hard to win a seat on the UN Security Council, which they did successfully, and digital was a big part of that. Trolling for effect, this is my favorite. So around the time of the annexation of Crimea, Canada's mission to NATO sent out this helpful map, for Russian soldiers who are getting lost in Ukraine. Russia, not Russia. And I think this was funny, but it was also important because it allowed Canada to remind everybody that they're actually a pretty big contributor to global security. So certainly people in the US would be like, oh yeah, Canada's a member of NATO, interesting. So it's sort of, hey, we're still here, we're still relevant, and we're going to poke fun at Russia. Russia, of course, was not going to take this lying down. So there was a real back and forth, and this was my favorite of their responses, which was, saying NATO has leaked the latest evidence of Russian incursion into Ukraine and its children's toys. I thought it was pretty funny. Collaborative policymaking, we're not quite there yet when it comes to foreign policy. There are good examples of collaborative policymaking in the domestic space. So, for example, like online petition pages, things like that, or websites like Fix My Street, where people make suggestions for either fixing things that are broken or improving services, things like that. But when it comes to foreign policy, we're not quite there yet. I think this is the aspiration of where we need to get to come up with platforms for how we can, how different countries and individuals can contribute to more foreign policy making. Really quick, my thoughts on the future. So hard power is not going anywhere. Unfortunately, it will always be with us, but soft power is becoming more important. Using soft power really requires an understanding of what you've got to work with at first. Digital diplomacy offers new ways to listen, to engage, and to influence global events. And there's an important relationship between soft power and digital diplomacy, and that's credibility. If you have a lot of soft power, you have a lot of credibility. People find you a credible partner. And if you're engaged in digital diplomacy, they're likely to listen and take on board your message. And finally, which I've basically just said, it's early days for digital diplomacy. I think the most amount of work needs to go into that collaborative policymaking space, like thinking of what are platforms or programs, apps, anything that can be done to help move that along and actually create genuine opportunities for collaborative policymaking. So that's it for me. Those are my thoughts on soft power and digital diplomacy. Thanks very much.